coming. We at the Cambridge Society of Economic Pluralism are delighted to have Professor Michelle Baddeley speak to us this evening. She is a Professor of Economics and Finance at the UCL Bartlett School of the Built Environment. She was previously a Director of Studies in Economics at Gonville and Caius. She holds a BA in Psychology from the University of Queensland and a MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge. Not that she's asked me to, but to plug her upcoming work.
Oh yes, comes out on Thursday.
Author of a very short introduction to behavioural economics, which is released in the next few days.
On Thursday?
On Thursday, okay, so no excuse not to buy it. So a warm welcome.
Thank you for the plug. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been presented here before. I do a bit of work on neuroeconomics with neuroscientists, so that was the last time I was here. So I'm an economist, but very interested in other social sciences as well. And I'm also very interested in public policy work, and so I do quite a bit of public policy advice. So this is some work I'm doing in this area, obviously very topical, because in the current environment, people aren't taking experts very seriously, and because they don't always get things right, and sort of trying to understand a bit about that. So the main two bits of policy work I do are with the Financial Conduct Authority and thinking about groupthink on investment committees. And then I also do some work for the Hazardous Substances Advisory Committee, which is an advisory committee to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs on environmental regulation. So I'll tell you a little bit about both those things. Let's see if we... there we go. So I'll give you some examples of experts, particularly from the scientific world, and then I'll give you a little bit of insight into psychological and social influences. Those of you who know a little bit about behavioural economics will know quite a bit about this already. I do a lot of work on herding and social influences, and the book I'm currently writing for Yale University Press is on the herding instincts and herding in various scenarios. But here I'll talk about behavioural bias as well, so some of you might know a bit about that already. And I'll talk about herding and social pressure, leading on to group decision making, because in a lot of policy advice, group decision making is quite important, because a lot of these decisions are made in the context of groups, and groups don't always work very well. And so I'll give a couple of examples and then some policy insights to finish off. I don't know the extent to which you might recognise some of these figures. So right throughout intellectual history, from Socrates onwards, Galileo, we've always had rebels, we've always had contrarians. And the problem with any sort of expert who's coming up with a judgment that's novel, we don't know at the time whether they're right or wrong. And so in the post-truth world, how do we judge the opinions or the judgments of experts? Because we don't know whether they're right or wrong. That's the starting point, we don't know. Over the course of time, we might discover whether they're right or wrong, but at the time we don't. So here are a selection of scientists, some of whom were right, some of whom were criminally wrong. So this woman here is Wayne Squire, and she is was a medical expert witness on cases involving shaken baby syndrome. So shaken baby syndrome is associated with a triad of symptoms on the brain and is meant to be a sign that a baby is being abused. She initially started off being witness for the prosecution, but over time, the number of cases she studied, she changed her mind and decided this triad of symptoms was not necessarily a sign that a baby had been abused and battered. And so she started to act as witness for the defence. And she got into quite a lot of trouble for that and was struck off by the General Medical Council and has recently been reinstated, but only on the proviso that she does not serve as an expert witness on defence cases in the future. Her career is shattered. The range of opinions from experts in her field are mixed. There's no conclusive opinion on whether she's right or whether she's wrong at this point. But any other medical expert witness who's tempted to go along and come up with some sort of similar defence arguments is going to be quite reluctant, because this woman lost her career over it. So that's quite a worrying thing. you might be too young to know of the MMR scandal. There's a guy called Andrew Wakefield. Measles, mumps, rubella vaccinations. Very important in childhood for these vaccinations to be given. And he came up with the idea, or circulated the idea, that these vaccines were associated with autism and with gastrointestinal complaints. He was later found to be presenting this evidence allegedly somewhat fraudulently. And in the meantime, a whole generation of babies were not getting these vaccinations. And those of you doing a bit of economics will know about the free rider problem. And what you find is if a certain proportion of people in a population are not being properly vaccinated, then the negative externality trips over to everyone else in the population because these diseases start to spread through the population a lot more quickly. So that's another case. Then another case of clearly criminal activity is Diederik Stapel, who's a sociologist who fabricated a range of evidence about something called the broken window syndrome. So the broken window is the idea that if people live in a disordered community with a lot of rubbish, litter, broken windows, derelict buildings, then criminal and antisocial activity becomes a lot more likely. So he did a series of experiments, or he claimed to have done a series of experiments showing that a particular dimension of this issue, his evidence on the broken window issue, he wasn't the pioneer of that. He just sort of built some evidence around that, and he just made it up. Just made up his data. No one challenged him explicitly. He had PhD students, he had young postdoctoral researchers in his team. Anyone who tried to say to him, look, I don't believe your data, he allegedly had quite a threatening personality, and he would bully them away from reporting him, but he was reported in the end, and a whole generation of PhD students had written PhD theses on the basis of data that had been made up. On the other hand, you have here Barry Marshall, who's a medical scientist who discovered that stomach ulcers had a bacterial cause rather than being stress-related. And at the time, he was vilified by some colleagues for this opinion because it was controversial. And the common medical view of stomach ulcers and stomach cancer that often emerges from stomach ulcers was that, he'd got it wrong. But throughout scientific history, there have been these sort of brave, mad scientists, I guess. He actually tested on himself. He drank a potion of this bacteria. He gave himself stomach ulcers. He gave himself antibiotics, and the stomach ulcers cleared up. So he proved to himself that his theory was right, and he went on to win the Nobel Prize in medical science for his discovery. So at the point at which these people are presenting their controversial novel research findings, we don't know whether they're right or wrong, whether they're making it up, whether they're coming up with a controversial view to make a career out of it, whether they're right and being vilified by colleagues who don't like don't like someone arguing against the accepted wisdom. We don't know at the time. So how can we make sure that scientific research, and I would include in that economic research and social science research, make sure that these group influences don't distort the path of knowledge? Because those of you studying economics will realise there's a certain accepted view of the world amongst economists, and it's very hard to establish a good academic career as an economist if you don't embrace that particular view of the world, because a whole load of academic economists have built their careers around it, and the time at which they feel brave enough to start saying, well, maybe something a little bit different is the correct account, is once they've won their Nobel Prizes, hence Krugman, Stiglitz, Akerlof, et al. And so how do we try and moderate some of these influences? So just to go back a step and talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we all get things wrong. Now, I'm not a behavioural economist who believes that everyone is irrational. I don't believe that at all. I don't think we've evolved to be stupid. I think that most of the time we do our best to get things right. And in our process of making judgments, we use heuristics. We use quick decision-making rules. And these enable us to decide quickly. Quite often, if we've got information overload or we've got choice overload, we're facing very complex decisions, we don't want to spend weeks and weeks deciding what to do. It's reasonable for us to try and decide as quickly as we can. The trouble is that when we try to decide quickly, using the various heuristics or rules of thumb that enable us to decide quickly, we're led into mistakes. And those of you who know anything about behavioural economics will know about Kahneman and Tversky. In Tversky and Kahneman's 1974 paper, they actually set out these heuristics in quite a nice structured way, along with the various biases that are associated with these heuristics. And I quite like the way they do this, because anyone who's gone on to, say, Wikipedia and looked up cognitive bias, you'll see a list of 100 or so biases, completely incoherent, no structure to it at all. And what I quite like about this paper is that it is set out quite carefully in quite a nice structured way. So one heuristic we use a lot, and explains why we might rely on emotions when we're making decisions, is the availability heuristic. We decide on the basis of information that's easy to recall, easy to remember, that is salient to us. Hence, emotions are very easy to recall. They have a strong impact on our decision making. The representative heuristic, we make judgments by analogy. We say, well, this situation is similar to another situation. So, for example, John Maynard Keynes uses metaphor a lot. And the use of metaphor is an example of a representativeness. This is this story, this new situation is similar to that. Sometimes it's good to use that sort of metaphor. I'm personally a fan of John Maynard Keynes, and I think he uses metaphors well. But other times these metaphors are just spurious and misleading. Anchoring and adjustment is a heuristic where we have a reference point. Rather than starting from the beginning, rather than starting from zero, we say, well, where are we now? And we move our judgments according to where we are now. And an example of that would be a social reference point. So, for example, in studies of energy consumption, if people are told what the energy consumption of their neighbours is, then they're more likely to adjust their consumption around this social reference point. And so this sort of discussion of heuristics and the biases associated with them lead on to Kahneman and Tversky's later analysis of unstable risk preferences. Who's studying economics here? Okay, so a few of you. You will know from your economic theory, both macro and micro, that there's an assumption of a stable risk preference. The rate of time preference, the discount rate, is assumed to be stable for rational agents, unless, since I stopped being a director of studies here, unless you're starting to do behavioural economics in your second year micro, whatever you do a bit of behavioural. Okay, so this idea that people have stable risk preferences, Kahneman and Tversky take this on. They say that people do not have stable risk preferences, and they set out a series of experiments to show that this is not necessarily true. And this has led to the emergence of something called prospect theory, which some of you might have heard about, that's very widely used now in behavioural finance, for example, to capture the fact that people's risk preferences aren't stable. Also, their time preferences aren't stable either, and that leads to a whole set of biases that I think are quite interesting around time inconsistency and present bias, and that actually is making its way into mainstream macro, for example. So are you still using ManQ as your macro text? ManQ has a little bit on time inconsistency and present bias. So it's increasingly coming into the mainstream. But it's the idea, present bias is a similar idea, that we don't have a stable time preference, what I was saying before, in fact, that we're disproportionately impatient in the short term. So that sort of summarises a lot of behavioural economics, what it focuses on, but my particular area of expertise is social influence, and focusing in particular on herding. Why do we copy other people. It's a very common trait. It's not very easy to explain in terms of standard economic theory, though economists have come up with explanations for it. So if we've got some private information, why do we ignore that private information to decide to do what the group is doing? What might be going on there? Well, there are a range of explanations. Economists have explained it in terms of a process of Bayesian updating, Bayesian learning. So when we see a group of other people doing something, that's informative to us, particularly if we're in a situation of profound uncertainty, there's not a lot of information around. So, if we're wanting to buy some shares, stocks and shares, for example, we know nothing about financial markets, we've got some money to invest. What we might do in guiding our decisions is just follow others in making our decisions. And so there's actually a stream of microeconomic theory that explains this in terms of Bayes' rule, which you have probably done in your first year stats if you're doing the economics tripos. So that Bayesian learning, they're using a mathematical rule. They're not maximising or minimising, but they're still using an algorithm. They're still using a mathematical way of thinking around things. Other themes that come through in this sort of relatively standard literature is links with risk aversion. You're protecting your reputation. It's better to be conventionally wrong than unconventionally right. So if you imagine that you're a trader on financial markets and you invest £1 million on investing in some particular sort of financial asset, and you do that in a very contrarian, maverick sort of way, no one else is doing the same thing. If you lose that bet, you're probably going to lose your job and, sacrifice your career. But if lots of other people around you are taking a similar risk, then you can say, well, other people made the same mistake. You can protect your reputation by doing what other people are doing. Rebelling against the herd is a risky strategy. And there also might be safety in numbers. So all these sorts of ideas you do see in the relatively standard economics literature that you see in the American Economic Review or Journal of Political Economy, of any of those sort of standard journals. But what's quite interesting is, apart from people like Bob Shiller, the economists don't really take on board too many of the socio-psychological influences, which I think are really quite interesting in terms of explaining the role that conformity, peer pressure, identity, all these ideas and insights from social sciences, how they come in to explain herding. My view would be it's a combination of the two. There's a part of us that's reasonable, relatively rational, that is processing information in a relatively logical way, but we come up against these emotional, socio-psychological influences, and what we eventually decide to do is sort of a balance between the two. Those of you who've read Kahneman's book aimed at a lay audience, Thinking Fast and Slow, that's an idea that he promulgates. It's an old idea, it's not his idea, it's been around for ages, and it goes back to Plato, in fact. But that idea of your system one thinking, which is the fast, quick, emotional, instinctive thinking, versus your slower, more cognitive, more deliberative thinking, my view is that herding can be explained in that way as well. So the socio-psychological, emotional stuff is the system one. The more, the things further up, the Bayesian learning, the more cognitive, deliberative stuff is your system two, and the two things are interacting to explain herding. So it's neither rational or irrational. So developing that point a bit, you can divide these influences into informational influences, so you learn from the actions and choices of others. You do what they are doing because perhaps they know something you don't, versus the more socio-psychological influences such as peer pressure, group norms, all those sorts of things that you would see in social psychology and sociology. Very famous set of experiments in social psychology that have been well replicated across a very wide range of studies is Solomon Asch's line experiments. Now, Solomon Asch had the idea that he could encourage an individual to give an obviously wrong answer to a simple question just by telling that individual that a whole load of other people disagreed with them. And so to do this, he set up experiments that have been replicated across a load of different contexts, but the basic idea is that he presented groups of experimental subjects with three vertical lines. Let's say a group of 20. The truth was that 19 of that group were actually in cahoots with the experimenter. They were experimental confederates. They'd been paid by Solomon Asch and his research team to lie to the 20th person. So they were asked, well, you know, line B, well, this horizontal line here, which does it match, A, B, or C? And Solomon Asch and his team told 19 of these people, just lie and say it's B. And the test in this experiment was whether the 20th person would change their mind. And what they found was not always, but really quite often, that 20th person would change their mind and give the wrong answer to a very simple question just because 19 other people had encouraged them to do so. And so that's the idea that there's a group influence there, that people are being manipulated by the group into a decision that is wrong. Now, in terms of how you might explain that, you could actually say, well, maybe that's a bit probabilistic. What are the chances that 19 other people are wrong and I'm right? Well, I make a probability estimate that it's very unlikely that 19 other people are wrong and I'm right, and so I agree with them. But certainly the evidence from these experiments were that it created a lot of anxiety in the people. They sort of knew they were right, and yet all these other people around them were telling them they were wrong, and it actually made them very anxious and insecure. But it's a manifestation of how the group can change the individual's mind. A bit later on, the economists came in doing some experiments to try and explain some of these phenomena, and that a series of experiments by Anderson and Holt on Bayesian herding. And what they were doing was getting a group of experimental subjects into a sequential herding process where there are two urns, urn A and urn B. And urn A had 2 red balls in it and 1 black ball in it. And urn B had 2 black balls and 1 red ball. The experimenters just tossed a coin and, without showing any of the experimental subjects, selected one of these urns according to the coin toss and put it into an unmarked urn. So the experimental subjects don't know whether it's urn A or urn B. They just don't know. And so what Anderson and Holt wanted to do was find out how people would make a judgment about it, whether it was urn A or urn B, by observing people making the decision before them. So let's say you've got a group of 20 people all deciding one by one which urn they think it's likely to be. And so the idea is that a person will pick a ball from the urn. So if they pick a red ball from the urn, they don't show the group which colour ball they've selected, but they pick the red ball, and if they're the first person in this queue of people deciding, they pick out a red ball, the chances are it's urn A. And so they announce to the group, I think it's urn A. The second person comes along, and let's say they pick a black ball from the urn. They've got conflicting information. They've got the signal from the previous person who said urn A, which suggests they probably picked out a red ball, and they've seen a black ball. Which do they do? Do they use their private information, the black ball they're looking at, or do they use the social information, the choice of the person before them, their inference about the choice of the person before them? They use Bayes' rule, which some of you will be familiar with. And what Anderson and Holt find with their experiments is the process via which people make this decision about urn A versus urn B is consistent with the application of Bayes' rule. So it's a Bayesian learning process. And so they do. And these experiments have been very widely replicated as well. My problem with these experiments is that there's no alternative hypothesis in a sense, because the only possibility is Bayes' rule or not. They don't take on board that there might be socio-psychological influences happening there as well. But that's been quite an influential set of studies that shows how the economists, the pure economists, look at that. And the example they often use, which I think is an example that has a lot of narrative power, is people going to restaurants. if you are choosing between these two restaurants, which one are you going to go to? You probably think, well, you know, what's wrong with this one? Why is no one in there? Why is it empty? Why has this one got a long queue? And it is true that people might tend to go into the restaurant that has the long queue, that has a crowd, because they're inferring something from that queue about what that queue of people might know about the quality of the restaurant. I've got a PhD student who's from China, and apparently in Hong Kong, in the restaurants in Hong Kong, they actually get people to join queues for restaurants because that will encourage other people to join the queues. So they actually pay people to join restaurant queues for exactly this reason. So the social influences are powerful in that context. So given the pluralistic theme, just saying a little bit more, so we've talked a bit about what the economists, what the social psychologists, what the sociologists say, but also the philosophers. There's an area, mathematical philosophy, and this is a person, Michael Weisberg, who's at Philadelphia, and we were shared a workshop together at one point. Our papers are in the Journal of Economic Methodology, and I really liked his one because it sort of shows something that is obvious. He's using computational modelling here and looking at populations with certain proportions of mavericks who just do the opposite of what everyone else is doing versus herders who do the same as what everyone else is doing. And what he shows with his computational modelling is that with just 50 mavericks in your population, you explore the knowledge landscape, the epistemic landscape, far more thoroughly. You get to learn a lot more if you've got a few people around who are prepared to rebel. Whereas if you've got everyone following one another, then you stay very concentrated on a particular set of ideas and theories. And you might argue that to an extent, maybe this left-hand panel describes the economists to an extent. If everyone's just, it's an echo chamber, everyone's just reinforcing what the current theory might be. Another thing about the information cascades, that the Bayesian social learning process, or however you want to explain it, is an economist you might have heard of, Amjit Banerjee, who wrote the book Poor Economics with Esther Duflo. But earlier on, back in the 90s, he did a lot of work on these information cascades. And he identified the problem of a herding externality. So if we go back to this idea that people have private information and they have information about what others are doing, if they ignore their private information, then that private information gets lost. No one can see it, take advantage of it, or even infer that it exists. So if we think of the restaurant example, let's say, you know, I have a friend who's told me that a particular restaurant is really good. I go to that restaurant and see that it's empty, and the social information is the queue for the restaurant next door. So I join the queue for the restaurant next door. That private information I have, useful information that could help other people if they saw me going into the empty restaurant, think, oh, you know, okay, maybe there's something there that's quite good. That private information gets lost. And Banerjee calls this a negative herding externality. When people just make their decisions on the basis of the choices of others, all the private information they have gets lost because no one can infer anything because that information is not used. And so that's the negative herding externality. The important thing about herding is it's neither right nor wrong. Sometimes the herd is right, sometimes the herd is wrong. There's no normative judgment about it, but it's just that if the herd happens to go down the wrong direction, any information that might tell them to go the other way just gets lost in this process. Another sort of related issue that I think is quite interesting from social psychology, some of you might have come across some of these experiments on obedience to authority. So a social psychologist called Stanley Milgram back in the 60s did electric shock experiments. And what he got people to do was to administer what they were told that they were administering electric shocks to people. In fact, they weren't. They thought they were, but they were administering shocks to actors who just pretended to be in pain. And what Milgram and his team found was that people were prepared to administer electric shocks, what they thought were electric shocks that were close to deadly, close to fatal, just because an authority figure had told them to do that. And so it's that idea was also picked up by a guy called Zimbardo, who was an expert witness on the Abu Ghraib trials in Iraq. And you might have heard of the Stanford prison experiment, where groups of students were told, they knew they were an experiment, but they were assigned roles, an artificial prison, and they were assigned roles of either prisoners or guards. And what the experimenters found was that people fell very, very quickly into their roles. So, they became what they were expected to be. And it's sort of a study in identity, which is also something that economists look at. For example, George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton look at identity. But identity obviously is a theme that comes throughout the social sciences. But people fell into these roles really very, very quickly. And so the students who were acting the role of prisoners became very subservient. The students who were acting the roles of guards became very aggressive and authoritarian. And the whole experiment got so out of hand, and even the experimenters started to become complicit in the behaviour. And the experiment got so out of hand they had to abandon it after 5 days. And so it's this idea that our social relationships and our social context have a very, very powerful influence on us. So that's sort of some of the background themes. So how can policymakers use some of this these ideas, and how does it come through? So this is going very much at sort of quite a different pace. So this is the environmental regulation, the Hazardous Substances Advisory Committee, and this committee is mainly toxicologists, environmental scientists, chemists, biochemists, but there are two social scientists on the committee. One is Susan Owens, who some of you might know because she's geography department here. She does a lot of stuff on environmental policy, and then there's me. And so it's an important committee in that it's examining the environmental implications of toxic substances, particularly things like endocrine disruptors that can affect us, nanomaterials, antibiotics, and all, guiding chemicals regulation. So if a company comes up with some new chemical, new substances, what sort of environmental regulation is implemented? And so some of the work we've done, particularly with Susan, is bringing in the social science to try and understand what's going on here, and looking at the sort of social influences and the behavioural biases from groups of experts. And it's particularly interesting in the case of new substances. So something like nanomaterials, it's a novel, innovative substance. And so we can't just look at frequency distributions and say, well, the historical evidence on this particular substance is that, in 1% of cases it creates this sort of problem. We can't do that because we're in a situation of profound uncertainty where we don't have frequency distributions. We can't look at the statistical likelihood of one event versus the other because there's no historical information at all there. And so there's profound uncertainty about potential consequences. And what was quite interesting about this is we did a paper on the quality of evidence. How do you assess the quality of evidence? So certainly economists, social scientists, natural scientists as well, are probably used to using quite objective evidence. So as economists, we might use, national statistics or whatever. But on something like nanomaterials, we don't have national statistics. We can use experimental evidence, being used increasingly in economics, a lot more experimental evidence coming through. We can use observational evidence, which is something, for example, behavioural ecologists use quite a bit of. Or we can use models in computational modelling, for example, which comes through particularly maybe, those of you from your macro might know a bit about that. Or epidemiological evidence, or anecdotal evidence. So, as many economists, probably social scientists more generally as well, anecdotal evidence, well, that anecdote is a dirty word in a lot of scientific investigation, but actually it was quite interesting to think about anecdote and to think about the idea that actually anecdote is not necessarily a bad form of evidence. And if you think of legal reasoning, for example, it's built around that sort of evidence. Another thing that came up was the diversity of representation. Getting a lot of different views on committees is important because you get away from this echo chamber idea that everyone's just reinforcing what everyone else thinks. If you've got a few mavericks in your group, then that will make a difference to the quality of the decision you make. I was in the Pentagon had a workshop back in September, and I came along and presented some of this sort of stuff. And they have, the Department of Defence for Intelligence, which is all the experts who are advising the policymakers around things like weapons of mass destruction, military intelligence, what's happening in Pakistan, Iraq, etc., etc. So a really interesting group of people. And they're very interested in this sort of groupthink echo chamber idea because obviously, if you get the weapons of mass destruction judgment wrong, that has enormous implications for a whole load of people. It's a very, very important problem to think about carefully. And in the Pentagon, they have a job role called Devil's Advocate, which I think is one of the coolest job titles out. A person who is there employed to argue with everyone else around them. And from that, how insightful, intelligent these groups were at the Pentagon just makes me feel really quite reassured about Trump at the moment, because I think, there's a load of clever people in the States who are going to have some good contingency plans in place. And I think at the time I was talking to one of them, that they were worried about Clinton and Trump in different ways, but really quite careful and thoughtful about the way they understood the relationship between the experts and the policymakers. So that was really quite interesting. But they were very much in favour of having this diversity of representation, of having the devil's advocates on their decision-making committees. So going back to HSAC, new protocols for the quality of evidence. And so it's really quite interesting because as an economist, this was not something I'd be used to sort of thinking about in this way. But even with the anecdotal evidence, thinking about, what is good anecdotal evidence? Good anecdotal evidence is consistency of accounts, is of high incidence of specific events or effects. And whilst you can't quantify it at all, if you're talking about nanomaterials when there's no evidence at all out there, maybe a little bit of anecdotal evidence at the very least can give you some insight into the sorts of questions you should be asking. So that's sort of a diagram capturing the way all the information comes together. What might be more interesting to some of you is the Financial Conduct Authority is currently conducting a study into asset management, particularly by the institutional investors. So the pension funds, the insurance companies, the charities, endowment trusts, and all those sorts of things. So they commissioned a group of us to do some work into the decision making on the oversight committees, for example, of pension funds. There was a strong focus on pension funds because, a good chunk of household wealth is held in pension funds. And they were interested particularly in this herding and social influence on the oversight committees. So on the oversight committees of the pension funds, these are the committees that make decisions about investments. Often they have lay members, they have people who are not particularly well informed about finance. They'd be interested because otherwise they wouldn't volunteer to be on the oversight committee, but they're not necessarily particularly knowledgeable. So they have to rely on advice from investment consultants. And obviously you don't necessarily have aligned interests in that case because the investment consultants might have their own products to sell or whatever. And so how to make sure that everything goes more smoothly, because the trouble with the asset management industry at the moment is there's a whole load of very complex costs and charges, like lists of over 300 different charges that different companies will be asking the pension funds to pay. Very confusing information. And so we did a range of, we talked through some of the stuff on asymmetric information, moral hazard, adverse selection, those sort of information problems that are pretty standard in economics. And then we did just an opinion survey to find out what people thought about that. and just thinking about how they're affected by the opinions of others. And the interesting thing here is that the opinions of others they know were pretty important when, maybe a bit too important relative to the opinions of others with expertise. But it is an opinion survey, and so the plan is at a later point to do some experiments around this. But so we looked at a whole load of different influences, stuff coming from sort of standard economics in terms of information, stuff coming from the behavioural economics in terms of various sorts of biases, particularly optimism bias and pessimism bias are things that come through quite strongly in behavioural economics these days, peer pressure, all these sorts of things. And it's quite interesting to see that uncertainty, second from the top, is one of the key things that really constrains people, which is not a surprise at all. But also some of these optimism, pessimism bias are coming out quite strongly as well. But that people were quite, to self-interest is not something that people were too worried about, so which is sort of quite reassuring overall. So, if people wanted to track down the details on this, that's the link to the publication. So the Financial Conduct Authority's proposed remedies to improve competition in this industry, to find ways in which the asset managers act more in the best interests of investors. So, for example, on pension funds, making sure that there's wide representation of all different sorts of groups. So often the trustees on these oversight committees, they're not paid. Their employer might be reluctant to give them time off work. All that sort of stuff might slow things down. Simplifying the fees, because the fee structure is really very complex. Getting the members of the oversight committees to have certain qualifications so that people could be reassured that they sort of knew what they were doing, all those sorts of things. And again, like HSEC, like the Pentagon, like wherever, this importance of diversity of experts, getting away from the echo chambers of everyone just, everyone agrees with each other, and so you never get any challenges in there. But they're recognising needing a diversity of experts, and replication, reporting of negative findings generally in science is something that needs to be focused on more. Mixed methods, not just looking at one type of evidence, looking at lots of different types of evidence, rethinking the incentive structures, which is an important thing, and moderating the social influences. Okay, so that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Professor Baddeley's kindly agreed to take some questions, so please ask away and speak clearly. Perhaps we could start on alluding to kind of a post-truth world.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think your research kind of gives us insight into what's the relationship between policymakers in this post-truth climate?
The big problem with the post-truth climate is that experts seem to have very little traction at the moment, and so the problem is going to be how to overcome that. How to get people to take experts seriously again. But, these things go in cycles. Historically, there have been similar episodes in the past. So I'm reading a book by Le Bon that some of you might come across, written about 200 years ago. And he's writing about very, very similar things, all about how people don't believe, particularly in times of nationalism, people reject the views of experts more and more. But I think it's important, this diversity of opinions idea, because the trouble is, let's say with Brexit, most people like me we don't like Brexit. I don't like Brexit, and I think this idea, we've had a democratic decision, therefore 16 million people have to shut up. I don't buy that at all. But everyone I talk to is like me, and they agree with me, and on Twitter and Facebook we're all agreeing with one another. And the people who were pro-Brexit are doing the same. And so you're not getting any sort of cross-fertilisation of the ideas. And there was there've been some really interesting programs on the radio, for example, recently about this. That if they've done experiments to show that, let's say with the Brexit example, if you go along to a Brexiteer with evidence that the economy won't do well with Brexit or whatever, their views become more entrenched when they're faced with contrary evidence, not less entrenched. So, for example, the people who voted for Trump, the more evidence they hear that Trump isn't such a good thing, the more pro-Trump they become. And so there's a very interesting psychology going on there. And I think understanding that psychology of how people respond to expert opinions, because a lot of people say it's not so much because it's experts, it's because it's elites, and that it's the elites are talking down to the ordinary person. And I think that's something that experts could really take on board. So if people voted, 52% of the voters voted for Brexit, trying to understand that, not saying, oh, well, they're all stupid, didn't really know what they're doing, and they, wait and they'll see what a disaster it's going to turn out to be. Instead of that, try to understand the opposite view more carefully. And if there are ways to, bring that into institutional systems somehow, to get away from this echo chamber idea that everyone's just sitting in their group, and particularly with social media. I mean, everyone on social media, they're seeing the views of their friends and their colleagues and the people they hang out with, or the people they've chosen to have something to do with. How do you get them to take more seriously the views of the people they don't come across at all? So I think it's a really, really interesting time. But I think it's really, I do get irritated by people like Michael Gove who say, you don't want experts. Daily Telegraph's not a newspaper I read very much, but there was a really funny article, and it was a spoof article, months back now. But it said, it had a load of examples, I don't know if any of you saw it, but it had a load of different examples, but it said things like, the only plane crashes that have ever been have involved pilots, those terrible expert pilots. We don't need any pilots anymore. So, the idea that experts don't know what they're talking about is quite problematic. And doctors, the only people who, doctors only see people who get ill. What's wrong with doctors? We need these experts, and we need to make sure that they have a credibility. The trouble with economics is there's a lot of uncertainty. Economists make forecasts, and often these forecasts turn out to be wrong with the benefit of hindsight, but on the basis of the information available at the time, those forecasts were the best you could get. And I think enabling people to understand that a bit better, that a forecast you make is a forecast, and sure, all sorts of random events come along that you can't predict. You can't predict them because by definition they're random. Just because the forecasts are wrong doesn't mean that the people who did them don't know what they're doing or aren't trying their best. But it's a really interesting question, particularly for economists, because we deal with uncertainty. We deal with profound uncertainty. We deal with very unpredictable events. And so, my view is Brexit will be bad for the UK economy, but I could turn out to be wrong for sure. All sorts of unexpected things. One reason why we might not do so badly is because Trump's going to do deals with Theresa May in the UK. That wasn't predictable back in June. So, the world is an unpredictable place. And I think education plays a strong role as well, so that people are able to make well-informed decisions and not get so easily persuaded. Some of the experimental evidence on social influences and herding is that people are far more likely to be persuaded by the group if they're not very well informed themselves. So in situations of uncertainty, these herding influences are a lot stronger. And so if we can do our best to encourage people to be well informed and knowledgeable about the decisions they're making or their voting choices, that might make a difference. Yeah?
Well, first of all, thank you. This is extremely interesting. I'm just curious if you think social media has sort of exacerbated or accelerated this phenomenon. Especially if you take everything that you just said about the less educated one is, the more likely they are to be subject to herding.
Or less informed rather than less educated,
right, sure.
yeah.
Sorry, less informed.
Yeah, I mean, my view would be social media as it is contributes to the problem. But if people are more aware, so this radio programme, it was a couple of weeks back on Radio 4, and people might have come across Peter Mandler. He's an historian here. He spoke in a really very interesting way about this problem with social media and echo chambers and all that sort of stuff. But that if people are aware of these problems and these biases and these social influences, then it did make me think, and there was another person on the same programme who said the same thing, that he's going to be very careful to make sure that he checks out all the people who disagree with him. You don't just dismiss, you deliberately go onto Donald Trump's Twitter page or whatever, you deliberately read his Twitter feed and try to understand what he said, or David Davis on the Brexit thing, but to actually expose yourselves to these contrary opinions and to try and understand where they come from, rather than just saying, well, I don't agree with that, my friends and colleagues don't agree with that, so these people must be wrong and stupid. To try and engage more in understanding the contrary views, and deliberately reading, newspapers are a bit old-fashioned these days, but deliberately reading a paper maybe that doesn't align very well with your political interests, just to see what that paper says. And in that sense, Twitter actually is quite good, because through Twitter I follow up on an article or something in, say, the Daily Telegraph, which isn't something I'd usually read. I get it via Twitter, so it's like all things in life. It's a bit of a mix, but I don't think social media has helped at all. But what do you do about that? We're not going to be able to regulate social media, nor would we want to, probably.
Well, I'm not sure how pension funds work exactly in Britain, but wouldn't you say that putting more experts in charge of the funds in pension funds, expecting them to make better returns, is it also a kind of a fallacy in a sense that many funds, like if we take into account the fees that we pay for managing the funds, that most of those funds don't overperform like the market. So isn't it kind of also?
So the idea with what the FCA is looking at for the bit of research we did for them was actually the oversight committees. So not the actual funds themselves, but the institutional investors and how they go about buying, bits of these funds. And I think that generally improving financial literacy and education is going to be a good way to go. So that someone on this oversight committee, so let's say a pension fund, and on some of the pension funds they'd have employee representatives. So these employee representatives would be contributing to the decision making, but they don't own a fund themselves. They're just deciding how their pension fund should be used. And if those employee representatives are expected to have passed an FCA accredited course to ensure that they have a certain level of financial education, so when an investment consultant comes along and tells them you should buy this asset, they sort of know what they're doing a bit more, would be the idea. But the costs and charges are very complex. I mean, I think it's widely recognised in the industry that these costs and charges could be simplified. I mean, is that the point you're making? Or?
The point is that the management of the pension funds is kind of useless in a sense that they don't really.
They don't have an incentive to worry about it, do you mean, or?
That it's an illusion of
control.
That you can get like better results and we pay for something, but in fact, if we take an average, it's not really worth the money that we pay.
Yeah, that would be true. Yeah, but if you have a choice between different assets, and if you've got an oversight committee composed of members who are a bit more knowledgeable, or less, a bit more impartial in some sort of way, that would help in terms of the management of the pension fund.
For sure, but if it's not something that would only mitigate the problem and not really a solution.
Oh no, it's never going to make the problem disappear. No. Yeah.
So the interaction with Brexit and Trump, do you think that a change in communication from rebutting the other side with evidence or whatever, so taking a different approach and trying to promote the pro side instead, which changed the situation? Because as you mentioned, and as it seems to me, if we are trying to rebut the other side, it just makes them even more convinced about their own points.
Yes.
Do you think that a shift from the negative rebuttal into the positive own side promoting approach?
Yes. I think it would because sort of if you'd say to someone, I disagree with you, you're completely wrong and stupid, well, they're going to close down. But if you say to someone, look, I understand your point and see what you're trying to say, but had you thought about it from this other point of view, and that's a sort of far more positive way to put it, I think people would be more receptive to that. I mean, I think it's complicated by the politicians, because the politicians all have their own careers to make out of all of this as well. So I think it's a very complex range of competing incentives that's sort of muddying the picture as well. And also with that Brexit campaign, there was so much misinformation coming from both sides as well that I think it just created a lot of confusion. But certainly if there was more of trying to understand, the people who say voted for Brexit who did so because they felt they had nothing to lose, or voted for Trump because they felt they had nothing to lose, trying to understand that a bit better. I mean, you could argue that all of this stems back to, 20, 30 years ago, from the time when, certain groups were excluded from a lot of the gains from globalization or the accumulation of wealth in this country, for example. A lot of groups were left out. What do they have to lose? If they're not doing very well anyway, maybe it makes no difference to them whether Brexit comes or Trump comes or whatever. Yeah, but trying to understand the opposing point of view, I think, is a very helpful way forward. And being more, people respond better to positive information than negative information, for sure.
We are the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. So I wonder what your thoughts are on how other schools of economics should use the insights from behavioural approach, and what is the future for other schools of economics with these new discoveries we are? Yes,
I think a very important point is not to lose some profound insights that have come from economics. And I think that it's very easy to say, economists are all wrong. And I think things like some of the literature on asymmetric information and the way that's been applied across so many different themes, and some of the work I do now, I do work with infrastructure companies, for example, Anglian Water, and they love to hear about the information problems, game theory, all that sort of stuff. That does have intuitive power. So I think it's important not to just say all of economics is wrong, let's toss it all out and start again from the beginning. But just making sure that the insights from social psychology, and also the natural sciences as well don't get lost. So I would say that the idea of moving towards a more pluralistic approach is really laudable. And bringing in all the other, not only the social sciences, but the natural sciences as well, but also things like, when I did my economics degree, I didn't have any opportunity to do computational modelling or coding or any of that sort of stuff. And I think some of those insights from and tools from computer science and whatever are going to be really powerful as well. So that sort of mixed methods approach. So your econometrics is never going to be perfect, because what if your data is not perfect? There's going to be measurement error, whatever. Computational modelling, simulation is not going to be perfect because you have to use assumptions. You have to assume something. What if your assumptions are wrong? Experiments are never going to be perfect because are your experimental participants motivated to participate properly in the experiment, particularly if it's an artificial scenario and they know they're in an experiment. So all these different methodologies have problems, but if you use them all together and they're all coming up they're all sort of confirming one another, and then that's really powerful body of evidence. So using a range of methods, not just saying, oh, well, econometrics is the way to go, or computational modelling is the way to go, or experiments is the way to go, all the other empirical approaches are wrong, I think is misguided. So just keeping on going with the pluralism and extending it more and more. I mean, UCL has its as a lot of you will probably know, has its economics course that's trying to embed more pluralistic approach. I think it could head more in that direction. I think certainly bringing in they're bringing in the history more, which is a good thing. But keeping going and pushing along on really developing a truly multidisciplinary approach to some of these problems, it could be very powerful and useful to people and to policymakers as well. Economists have a lot of power and influence. People take economists seriously, and if that influence can be used for good and in an intelligent way, then I think economics has an enormous amount to offer.
Also, you mentioned econometrics, and so what is your approach to outliers?
I think trying to understand the outliers. I know, and I don't do so much econometrics anymore, but I know some people's approach to outliers is to drop them. Or you can put in a dummy variable into your econometric model to just bring it in. I would think trying to understand why the outlier is an outlier.
But like in the research, they shouldn't usually if there's data, they don't mention. For example, they just drop them and don't even mention them.
Yeah. No, there's one of the problems with econometrics is and that's why actually, and the economics journals are doing this now, making sure that people publish, make their data available, because with an econometrics paper, you're not reporting at that level of detail, and so if you're not showing your data to people, a person could get away with just dropping the outliers and not explaining what they're doing. I mean, my econometrics is a little bit old-fashioned, but I know the latest econometric tools have ways of dealing with these outliers. But I think it's information. The outlier is informative, and so, don't drop it. Try and deal with it somehow. But, sure. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which people can, econometrics can... When you report it in a short paper, you're not going to explain every little thing that you did, and so there's it's an asymmetric information problem there, I guess.
Perhaps one last question.
No?
Or else? No? Well, then, I guess thank you so much to Professor Baddeley.
That's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So, a round of applause.
Okay, thank you.